my name is Bob Knight. I'm the director of the Howard T. Odom Florida Springs Institute located in High Springs, Florida. I've been working in Springs since the 1970s with my doctoral research at Silver Springs, and what I've found in that time is that Silver Springs can never be restored to what it was in the past without the removal of the Rodman-Kirkpatrick Dam on the Ocklawaha River. The Ocklawaha River needs to be freed to allow the safe and convenient passage of migrating animals, especially fish and manatees, back into Silver Springs. That hasn't been accomplished since a long time ago. In other words, my work there in 1979 and 1980 documented the reduction of fish populations by about over 60% compared to studies done previously in the 1950s. And that was within 10 years of the dam closing. And the fish that really disappeared from Silver Springs were the striped mullet and the channel catfish that had been so abundant there in the 1950s. The loss of those fish led to just a cascading change in the ecosystem in Silver Springs. The loss of the algae-eating mullet allowed the proliferation of algae to where populations of algae in Silver River increased many fold from undetectable essentially in the 1950s to over half of the total plant biomass in the system. And that may sound good from a standpoint of algae are primary producers. They produce food, but it turned out in later studies that nothing in Silver River wants to eat algae. They're unpalatable, they're noxious, frequently they're toxic even, and they displace the native plants that provide food for the fish and wildlife that naturally lived in Silver Springs. All the herbivorous fish, the insects, and the turtles, and of course manatees. So with reconnecting Silver Springs to the St. Johns River and to the Atlantic Ocean, those migratory animals would return. And those not only include mullet and channel catfish, that also includes striped bass, which really relied on the Ocklawaha River and the Silver River as a place for breeding and propagation in the past. That would be a miracle to have the striped bass come up in large numbers into Silver River the way they did in the past. And Silver River has been identified by the various organizations interested in protecting manatees as a prime resource for the expanding manatee population in Florida. Spring-fed rivers are essential for the existence of manatees in and around the Florida Peninsula. And they provide irreplaceable habitat for wintering during cold weather because of the need for a warm water refuge by these manatees. And secondly, they, under their natural state, produce a lot of food, vegetation that the manatees prefer. And it turns out the Silver River is one of those places that has that kind of habitat. Perfect thermal refuge over a very large area, 5 miles of river and a large head spring area, and lots and lots of food in the still remaining native vegetation that's in the river. In fact, I believe that Silver Springs could support easily over 100 manatees, and probably many more than that. And the Silver River State Park, which is a fairly new state park, reformed in 2013 from the Silver River State Park, now is receiving about 300 to 400,000 visitors a year. I expect that the visitation and the effect on the economy would be enormous, because with manatees in the Silver River on a regular basis in large numbers, I expect we'd have over 1 million visitors a year to Silver Springs and the Silver River. There'd be no other place in the interior of the state where you could go see so many manatees as it would be on Silver Springs. So ultimately, the Silver Springs and river can't be restored without reconnecting it to its natural waterway, the connection to the St. Johns and the Atlantic Ocean. And there are other things that need to be done too, but restoration isn't possible, complete restoration isn't possible without reconnecting the river. So manatees are a real draw on tourists in Florida, and tourism is, of course, the largest economy of Florida. There's no doubt about it that tourism is what makes the state great and economically viable. And manatees are a major attractant at Volusia Blue Springs, where they have up to 400 manatees during the wintertime in that one spring run, very small spring run. And at Kings Bay Crystal River, where they have up to 700 manatees in the wintertime. But both of those systems are very impacted already. There's no vegetation in either of those that manatees can eat. So manatees that come in for a thermal refuge at Volusia Blue have to go out in the St. Johns River to find food, and they have to travel a long ways to get food. And if they're caught out there during really cold weather, they're gonna die from cold stress. Kings Bay is the same way. Kings Bay is connected to the Crystal River, to the Gulf of Mexico, but there's essentially no vegetation anymore in Kings Bay or in Crystal River. So the manatees actually have to go 7 miles out to the Gulf of Mexico to get a meal while they're there, and they can only stand several days without eating because they are big cows of the sea. They are sea cows, and so when you go to Crystal River now, you can hardly see the manatees. The only place you can see them is actually in the springs at Three Sisters and maybe at Hunter Springs. But otherwise, you can't see 6 feet through the water at Kings Bay because of the algal populations that have developed in there for problems related to development in the area. At Volusia Blue, it's a very small area. They can't get enough people in the park. There are 500,000 people a year want to get in there to see those manatees, and they can't fit any more people in the park during the manatee season. Silver is a great place, not only for the manatees, for the benefit of the manatees. I don't think there'd be any problem at all that it could harbor many more than manatees than even Volusia Blue could. There's plenty of food, there's plenty of area, and then it's a very good place to see the manatees because the last few years, some manatees have been escaping through the lock and getting up into Silver Springs, and you can see them from the glass bottom boats. So economically, I think $1 million is a good low estimate for the amount of human activity at Silver Springs, because it's such a large area. It's got so many diverse things to see, as well as the biggest spring in the world. And then to have those manatees there on top of that, I think we'd easily see 1 million people a year. And also, Silver Springs is it's the biggest spring in Florida historically. It's near the middle of the state. It's very near an interstate. And so it's very accessible. It's the most visited spring in Florida throughout history. When I was there in the 70s, it was half the people were speaking foreign languages. They were here because Silver Springs was famous worldwide, and it will be again. There were 1 million visitors a year when I was at Silver Springs in the 70s, when it was an attraction, and there would be that many again or more, which will just stimulate the whole side of Ocala that's called Silver Springs. It's a small, really underdeveloped, harmed part of town that would just be rejuvenated by having manatees, having mullet, having channel cats, and having a healthy Silver Springs again. One thing that I'm personally doing to try to make that happen is it's been my dream for about 40 years now, and before that, Dr. Odom's dream, to build an environmental research and science center at Silver Springs. And the Florida Springs Institute is actually taking that plan and running with it. And we're actively raising money now to build a educational institute, Silver Springs Environmental Center, at the site of the former Wild Waters at Silver Springs. And that will be the gateway really to the Silver Springs State Park. Everybody that drives into the park will be driving right by this environmental center, where all the interpretation and education will be done. All the local groups interested in springs will have access there to further their mission to inform people about springs. And finally, it'll be the Center for Research on Florida Springs. Florida has over 1,000 artesian springs. It's the biggest concentration of artesian springs in the world, and we are the epicenter of springs in the world, and yet through lack of really awareness, they're not doing very well. Our springs are being harmed, and one of the things that's harming them, of course, is rivers that are dammed up, and we hope to see a change at Silver Springs and the Silver River.